Hey there, folks. So, last episode we had started working on the handheld items, whatever you want to call it. For the sake of my project, I'm actually calling them a weapon item base. We got some of the basic stuff done in here, but there is a couple of additional things I want to include. Before I go into that, though, just to bring back our little I don't want to call it a class diagram. It's sort of a class tree, and even that's a little questionable. So in here, you can see we've been working on the weapon item. I had mentioned we're going to work on the melee item this episode, which is what we're going to do, but there's a couple of things I need to address before that. So for that, one of the things that I want to address is in here, if we go back to our equipable item base, you can see we have a skeletal mesh actor, or skeletal mesh reference in this case, for the item that is to be displayed on the character. Now, the problem there is not all weapons are going to be a skeletal mesh. Apparently I left my phone on again. Not all weapons or handheld items are going to be a skeletal mesh. Think a glass jar or a baseball bat. They don't need to be a skinned skeletal mesh. They have no independent animations. You don't have like a bolt on a rifle that you need to move or anything like that. So, resource wise and just asset wise, it makes sense for those to be a static mesh. So we're going to need a way to address that. So in our weapon item base, we're going to add a couple other things in here. So I'm going to grab this U property we've got here. Why is that one so different? Edit defaults only, blueprint read. Oh, copy paste, added spaces in. So I was trying to figure out why these two were on like entirely different line lengths. So let's fix that out so they're universal. Anyways, so what I want to do here, we're going to add in another property that is, again, edit defaults only. And this is just for those who can't remember or haven't really been following along yet. That an edit defaults only allows you to just modify it within the blueprint actor you create. You cannot edit it in the scene. You cannot edit it through blueprint code because we have the blueprint read only. So this is going to be a Boolean value, and it is going to be b use static mesh. We're going to say false for this, so false. And then we're also going to add a u static mesh pointer, static mesh. No, I don't want to call it static mesh. Weapon mesh. So the whole purpose for this is for adding the mesh to the character. We're going to need to either add it as a static mesh or a skeletal mesh. So, but on top of that, we're not actually going to be adding I'm trying to think of the word I want to hear. A direct static mesh or a direct skeletal mesh to our character. We're actually going to be attaching a child blueprint. So, now, this is also going to depend, well, this next one I should say, is also going to depend on how the assets in your project are created, acquired, and designed. So, let me open up Blender here. Give me 1 second. Okay, I can't open Blender. It seems I have an update pending. So, with that though, to save trying to expand on that and not continue where I'm going, well, actually, no, to expand on that, not just sort of wait. Every actor skeletal mesh or static mesh has what is called its point of origin or its pivot point, or there's a lot of different terms for it, but that is where on the mesh itself the 000 point is. And that's a relative to the mesh, not to the world or anything like that. So, excuse me. What you need to account for there is that. So we also need to add in a... well, actually, before I go into that, so you're going to want to provide a way to, and again, this is based on how your assets are defined, to adjust the relative offset of said asset based on where its origin point is. So you will have, if you're somebody like myself, I'm not a masterful 3D artist, I'm a programmer. My assets I acquire from the asset store, from Humble, from third-party creators. I'll just throw everyone into that because that's the best way to describe it. And not every single person uses the same, I don't want to say rules, but the same methodology for creating assets, and the point of origin isn't always going to be, say, if being held, the point of origin would be the middle of a palm. Things like that. So you're going to need a way to adjust for that. Also, different content creators will use the x-axis forwards, or the y-axis forwards, or the z-axis forward. So you're going to want to account for that as well. Now, you have two ways of going about this. You could go F vector mesh offset and F rotator mesh offset rotation, which is perfectly fine if you want to do that because you want to have just those two. The other option, and it's actually the method I'm going to be going for, and that's just because, again, some scales are also slightly different. Like, I may get a baseball bat from one asset creator that is scaled to a 7-head tall human because it's the heroic, or is that 7 or is that 9? I can't remember, but we'll say it's scaled to 7-head humans, and then I get a baseball bat with nails through it that's from a different creator that uses, say, an 8-head scale for a human. So the bats are scaled differently, and then ultimately the character mesh I'm using are scaled to 9 heads. Again, I'm just picking arbitrary numbers. I'm not saying that's the way they are. It's just for this purpose of the example. So with that, I may also need to adjust the scale of the asset. So instead of using an F vector and an F rotator, pretty obvious F transform. And this is just going to be called mesh offsets. Offsets with an S. And the whole purpose for that is, again, purely so we can adjust based on the center of origin, adjust based on the rotation, and adjust based on the scale. It's all stored within one item, like one data value. So, with that, we've got almost everything we need done here to move on to our melee weapon. The only other thing, and this is going to be, again, depending on how you want to set things up, what I want to do for the purpose of animations is I don't want to have... I'm trying to think how to describe this. A huge list of, or a very expansive anim blueprint that's got all these different anim states and things like that. What I want is each weapon to have a animation set that, when used, the event within the character, so when primary action is called, it will modify back to the owner, things like that. What will happen is the animation will be pulled from this data asset, and the character will be told to play this asset, this animation asset. So there is a little bit more to that, though. And bear with me 1 second here. Sorry, I just had to find my notes. Again, this is going to be down to how you're setting up the structure of your game, the characters in your games, things like that. You can have assets based on, like animation assets, I should say, excuse me, that are particular to a skeleton. I'm just trying to think of the right terms to use here, because certain skeletons only have certain assets, that, like animation assets, that they can play. So if you've ever messed around with that, if you have an animation asset that's not correctly targeted for the mesh you're using, things get really weird. I'll just say that. So that is something else to keep in mind when you're working on this, is you need to make sure that the animations you're using are the correct for the skeleton, so on and so forth. But what I need to do here, and this is purely because I can't remember the name in C++ for it, is I need to, let me just get a browser open here, UE5 C++ animation data type. Oh, why is it giving me videos? Anim montage. I'm trying to remember. It's an anim sequence, I believe. Anim sequence, that's it. So, again, edit defaults only. Anim sequence, pointer, primary action animation, and we're going to have a second one, which is going to be for the secondary action. So that's where we're going to leave things off here. And the reason being is this, all of this information that we've added in, the use static mesh, this actual static mesh, the mesh offsets, and then the primary and secondary animation action, no, action animation, I should say, are something that is going to be, excuse me, I cannot talk. That is something that's going to be universal to all of these items. So, and that's the way to look at this class tree, is if the item is used, or sorry, the logic is used by two or more children of a class. So, for example, we'll take equipable. If there is logic that is going to be used by, actually, no, we'll start with item base, because that's got 3 children. So, if there is logic that is going to be used by consumable and equipable, but not junk item, we'll still put it on the item base, because then you're only writing the code once. If there's logic that's going to be used by all 3, consumable, equipable, and junk item, well, obviously throw it on item base. But if it is unique to consumable, actually I'll change that. If it's unique to equipable and equipable's children, only leave that information on equipable. Like that logic, you don't need to add it back to item base. So because all of those things we've just added are going to be used by melee or ranged, and that doesn't matter if it's a thrown or it's a liquid container based on what we mentioned with ranged and how I want to do those, this logic is going to get logic data is going to get added to the weapon class. So now we've done that, we are going to do a quick build here and make sure all of this works, because the next thing we need to do is go through and create that melee weapon class. So this may take a moment. I've done some source control work since then, so it's got to rebuild a bunch of stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video, and I will be back as soon as we're either in the editor or there's a build error. Alright, so here we are in the editor. So build went through fine, and there's no issues there. However, I did want to actually just take this as an opportunity to show what I was talking about regarding the weapon mesh or the equipment mesh. So in here, you can see I do have some static mesh actors for various weapons. I don't think there's any skeletal weapons in this asset pack. No, there isn't. But there has been quite a few, and it's normally things like weapons. Here you go. You can see there's a rifle and there's a pistol that are skeletal mesh because they may have animations tied to them. So let's pop this open quickly. I say that, and it takes forever to load. And what screen? There it is. I don't even know if there's any animation assets for this particular one. But take a look at the skeleton. Yeah, there's no animations for it, but you could potentially have an animation in there with the, drawing a blank in the word here. Nope, it's completely gone. Slide, that was the word I was looking for. The slide on the pistol would go back for ejecting the shell and things like that. So this is a low poly one, so I'm guessing there's no animations, but you can see here, like, the slide goes back, a round is ejected from the chamber, and so on and so forth. So that's why you're going to want the ability to have both a skeletal or a static mesh for your equipment. Now we've got that, we're going to switch back down to our C++ stuff, get rid of our filter. So we're going to go to project, public, items. We have our weapon item base here, so we're going to expand on that, and we are going to create a C++ class derived from weapon item base. And this one we are just going to call melee item base. Now, there's not going to be a huge amount that we need to add to this class for the purpose of getting things up and running. So I'm just looking at my notes here to see everything I'd want to add to this. So in our weapon item, you can see we have our base damage, we have our handiness, and then we have the stuff we've just added, obviously. So what we would want to do in here is, because there is going to be, ultimately, once I get that far and further along in this series, there's going to be character attributes, like there's going to be strength and things like that, because ultimately, like I said, I want to try and create a somewhat realistic survival simulator. And with that, you're going to be able to adjust your character. You can have a stronger character, weaker character, smarter character, dumber character, things like that. I haven't quite fully fleshed out how I want to do that. So one of the things I do know, though, is I do want to have strength, obviously. So what we can do here, let's go back to our weapon item base and grab this one here. The edit defaults only, blueprint property, read only, meta, allow private access. Actually, yes, we can reload all, and yes, we're going to stop debugging. Excuse me. Save that because we want to keep that information, and then we'll go back to our melee item base. So in here, we want to add in that U property we just copied, and I'm going to go float strength multiplier. No, strength damage multiplier. And for this, I'm just going to set it to a default of 1. So what that's going to be is there is a 0 impact based on strength. 1, anything times 1 is obviously still itself. We're going to say, we'll take a hypothetical, it's a scale of 1 to 10. Well, it's not going to have any impact. A particular item would have no impact if it's strength 1 or strength 10 is the purpose of this variable. Over and above that, there is a few other things I want to add in, but they're outside of the current scope of this setup. Excuse me, I was just trying to, there we go, rearrange my seat. With that, there's things like I want to add in potential for bleed effect or poison or other things like that. Like, so say you have, going back to that bat analogy, you have a bat on its own, or example, not analogy, which is really just going to cause blunt damage. You have a bat with nails that is going to have blunt and piercing damage, but as part of that piercing damage, it can cause bleed, and other things along those lines. So I do want to account for that, but again, that's outside of the current scope of this. So with that, actually, probably shouldn't have loaded all. I should have waited because there's one more class we need to make here. And that's going to be our, the blueprint actor that we spawn on the character. So what I'm going to do here, like I say, this is just a very basic, it's a data class that we're going to be using. So the other thing we need to do is actually, I'm going to copy that blueprintable and add that in there, because otherwise we can't use this within the game. And this is something I'm going to be going through a little later on, once all of this stuff is done. But certain items here are not going to be blueprintable. Like, let me change you down to 2 pixels and switch you over to red quickly. So item base obviously isn't, equipable isn't, clothing is, container is, consumable will be, weapon itself won't be, a ranged item will be, thrown, liquid, like these are data classes. They themselves are not meant to be an item on their own. So the whole purpose of these is, as mentioned, they are a parent data class to add information and functionality that is going to be used by all of the child classes. So now let me just undo that. I don't want to leave that on there. So with that, though, as mentioned, we want to hop back into the editor, because the last thing we need to do is create what is going to be the blueprint class, and it's going to be a generic one for the item that is applied to, or spawned, I should say, and attached to the character. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pause this, and I will be back once we're in the editor, because we are running a little low on time this episode. Alright, so we are back in the editor, and this is actually going to be a pretty quick one to do. We're going into our C++ classes, remove our filtering there. Obviously project, public. Now it's not going to be an item. This is going to be a base class. So what we're going to do here is right click, new C++ class. This is going to be an actor. We're going to click next, and this is going to be obviously your project acronym. So TF in my case, equipped, character item base. Now it is a complex name, which that is something to also, I shouldn't say complex name, it's a long name. That's something to consider when you're naming your classes. The longer names mean you're obviously typing out more code when referencing things. And it's trying to find a happy medium between like acronyms. So like this could be ECI base for equipped character item base, but ECI could stand for a lot of different things. So ultimately it's going to be down to yourself, your project, and the team that's working on your project. And even if it's just yourself, that's something, as I've mentioned before, to take into consideration. What would happen if you get successful with your project and you pull in additional help? You want to try and find that happy medium between a long name that is very explanatory. In this case, equipped character item base tells you exactly what it is. It's the item that's equipped by a character. So However, I am going to leave it as that because I would rather type out a little longer string of code than have some question as to what the item is, or what the class is, I should say. So, okay, this time around, reload all, stop debugging. Yes, we don't need to worry about that. So, all right. So we've got our equipped item base. Well, one of the first things we want to do is we need to have on our equipped item base a reference to weapon item base. Because a weapon item, again, actually this is a case of I really should have changed the name to something different. This should have been equipped, or no, equipable. No, handheld. Either way, the weapon item base doesn't give you the name you'd be expecting. So I'm going to copy that. And I'm actually going to add it to our header because we're using it as a data object, and we're going to be storing in here the item that needs to be equipped and all of its relevant information. So I'm going to quickly clean this up with my normal formatting process, where it's private, protected, public. And again, that is not needed. You could, if you really wanted to, have private, if I could spell. Thank you. There we go. So you could have private, then you could have public, private, public, public, protected. It's not going to cause compilation issues. It's just, it's not as clean, it's not as nice, in my personal opinion. So that's why I move things around, rearrange it in an order that makes sense. So the reason why I've added this here, now that we've done that, is when this is constructed, and this is something that's going to be constructed at runtime. We're not going to have 100 of these or 1,000 of these or however many handheld items you want. We're not going to need to go through and create a blueprint class for every single one of those. It's going to be created itself, like at runtime with all of the relevant information. So weapon item base, I'm just going to grab this here. Again, this is because my spelling is atrocious. Item to use. And for ease, I'm going to copy this, and we're going to head over to our source file and throw this into the constructor. Now what this is doing is this is saying to the code is the only time we can successfully construct a and actually this might not work with Unreal. So let's run a build, and then we're also going to launch into the editor just quickly because I have some concern, because I know Unreal tries to create a class of everything. Yeah, that's what I was concerned of. So we do need to have a default constructor, that does not require an input parameter. So let's try this again once we define this. Okay, now let's try another build. So anyways, going back, the whole purpose for this is so that when we create this class at a code level, we just pass in this item here, and the class itself does all of the construction that needs to be done. It assigns all the data, everything there. So, okay, that build worked, so we're good there. Don't want this to tick, so I'm actually going to set this to false. I don't know what the default is for that. Let's actually go to declaration. You're going to let me... Default is true. So for anyone who does not know what a Boolean is at a code level, it is literally either a 0 or a 1. 0 being false, 1 being true. So this tells me straight away, by default, everything is set to tick. Not a fan of that, but fair enough. So figuring that out, we're going to turn this off on both the default constructor and our primary constructor. Now, what other information do we need to pull out are we going to need? So we have in our weapon item and our equipable item, we have a skeletal mesh or a static mesh, depending. So we're going to need that. So in our private section, we are going to go U property. Actually, I'm not even going to call it a U property. I'm going to just leave it as a local one. U skeletal. Okay. Mesh component. Trying to think what I want to. Skeletal item. U static mesh component. Static item. So what we're going to want to do here, and I'm going to just finish these two up and then we're going to end the episode. We'll carry on in the next episode for this, but so in here, excuse me, actually, no, I'm sorry, I'm going to make a quick change here. We do not need to know about all the internal workings of the weapon item in the header file. I'm going to move this over to the source. So in here with our, actually I'm also going to do this quickly. No, sorry, I said I was going to finish that off. So there's a few other things I want to do for this, but in here we're going to go item to use, use skeletal. Actually, I made that as a protected. We're going to make a public void for that. Void, no, sorry, it's bool use static mesh const, and this is going to be in the header, return be use static mesh. All right, so what we've done here is we've just set that boolean in function up, sorry, and we're going to go if item to use static mesh else. So this is one of the very few cases you're going to see me use an if else. I do like to avoid using if else statements where possible. Personal preference, I just find it's cleaner when you're not using an if or an else, but this is one of the few cases. So if it's use a static mesh, we are going to go static item equals create default sub object use static mesh component text, and this is going to be static mesh item. Else it's going to be skeletal item equals create default sub object use skeletal mesh component text. Skeletal mesh item. Add some spaces in there because that's for human reading, not for the computer. So what we've done here, and this is where I'm going to end things off because we are coming up on 35 minutes. This is just the basics, but this is how we're going to go about creating the particular child component to this, what's going to be a blueprint actor. Which reminds me, actually, we are going to determine, okay, it's using a static mesh or it's using a skeletal mesh. So with that, though, folks, I'm going to end things off here. Next episode, we're going to continue on. There's some more functionality we need to add in here because right now there's no way of pulling out these mesh. There is a way of pulling out the skeletal mesh, but not the static mesh, and there's other things we need to do there. So With that, though, folks, as always, thank you for watching. If you have any comments, questions, suggestions, concerns, please feel free to either leave them in the comments below or hop over onto the Discord and ask your question there. Respond as often as I can, and always happy to help out because I know my tutorials aren't exactly perfect. So if you're following along and you stumble into something, please feel free to reach out and ask for help. But thanks again, and I will see you in the next episode.